Hi, welcome to the Personal History Hub. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at more Cold War content, and we're thinking about what happened to Berlin after World War II and the Berlin crisis of the 40s. So let's talk about the division of Germany in 1945 to start with. Okay, so as you can see from this picture, you can see the way that Germany was divided up in 1945. So as we discussed, because this was agreed at the conferences, so if you want to have a look at this in more detail, go back to the previous video on the three conferences. Okay, so Germany was to be split into four zones. So you had the French zone, the Soviet zone, the British zone, and the American zone. And the same thing was going to be happening with Berlin. Okay, so Berlin, as you can see the little star. Right, so just here is inside East Germany. So because the Western countries were not willing to let the Soviets just have Berlin, the capital of Germany, okay, they also divided that down into four equal parts. Okay. So that shows you as well the division of Berlin in 1945. So at Potsdam, as we've previously discussed, the Grand Alliance agreed to divide Germany and its capital Berlin into four separate occupational zones, administered by the Soviet Union, the USA, Britain, and France. The division was meant to be temporary, but ended up lasting for many years. There's something called the Allied Control Commission, or the ACC, which was set up as the central organisation for the four zones. There were soldiers on the streets, and in Berlin, military checkpoints between the zones. There were disagreements between the occupying powers. The three Western countries and the Soviet Union had different ways of looking at Germany. Soviets wanted to take as much material as possible back to help rebuild the Soviet Union, whilst the Western countries wanted to build up Germany's economy. So they kind of learnt their lesson from the problems that happened in Germany after World War I. So in December 1947, talks between the foreign ministers of the occupying powers broke down and the Soviets stormed out. So uniting the Western zones. So with the Soviets no longer cooperating, the remaining allies, so that's the USA, Britain and France, had to decide how to run their part of Germany. The British and Americans had already combined their zones into something called Bizonia in 1947. And in March 1948, the French added theirs to create something called Trizonia. Although this was never their intention, the result was that Germany and Berlin were now split into two parts, the Western Trizonia and Eastern Soviet-controlled Germany. But then in June 1948, the three allies created a single currency known as the Deutschmark, Trizonia economic unity. The decision to introduce the Deutschmark took place at an ACC meeting in Berlin. The Soviets were furious about the decision for two reasons. One is that the new single currency in Trizonia created a separate economic unit from the East, and two, it acknowledged that there were in effect two separate Germanys, West and East. To Stalin, this was a further example of the West ganging up on the Soviet Union, and he saw the formation of Trizonia as a means of deploying the three zones more effectively and deliberately forcing the Soviet zone into poverty. He was now even more determined to stand firm and protect Soviet interests in Germany. He believed Germany should be one united country and that it should follow communist ideology. Okay, so that just shows you the way that Berlin was divided into West Berlin. So between the three allies, they merged to make West Berlin, and then East Berlin. Okay, so and it's all surrounded by East Germany. So what actually is the Berlin Airlift then? So Stalin knew that the Western occupied zones of Berlin were vulnerable, as they were entirely surrounded by Soviet occupied territory. So as we saw in that previous map, okay, the section, I'll go back for a second. So the section of West Berlin here is completely surrounded. So all of this land surrounding it is all part of East Germany. So remember that Berlin is quite far to the east in Germany and it's inside the Soviet zone. Okay, so Stalin knows that this gives him a bit of an advantage. So in addition, there were just two agreed land routes and two air routes or corridors across the Soviet zone of Germany to Western occupied Berlin. So in June 1948, Stalin decided to shut off the land routes across Soviet-controlled Germany into Berlin in what has become known as the Berlin Blockade. He wanted to show the USA, Britain and France that a divided Germany would not work. So Trizonia would no longer be able to communicate with the capital Berlin. people of Berlin would soon run short of food. If the blockade was successful, Stalin would win a huge propaganda success at the expense of the West. It might also mean the Western powers would give up control of their zones in Berlin and allow the whole of the capital to be controlled by the Soviet Union. This was a direct challenge to Truman, and Stalin knew he could not ignore the blockade because of his recent speech about defending the world from communism. The West knew that an attempt to force supplies to Berlin along the closed land routes would be seen as a potential act of war, might lead to direct military confrontation. However, if they flew supplies into their zones in Berlin, the only way they could be stopped was if Stalin had the planes shot down, and that would make him look like the aggressor. And Truman doubted that Stalin would actually go that far. So the Western Allies therefore launched something called Operation Victuals, better known as the Berlin Airlift. They flew food, coal, and other necessities assembled in the Allied zones along the air corridors. The pilots took a huge risk as they could not be sure the Soviets wouldn't shoot them down. So the people of West Berlin and Western troops in the city joined forces to create a new airport so that supplies could be landed in the Western zones. Ordinary citizens helped to unload the planes and hand out the essential supplies to all who needed them. So the Americans were soon able to fly in at least 1,000 tons of supplies every day, and the British achieved a similar rate. In the peak month of flying in January 1949, no fewer than 170,000 tons of supplies were sent into Berlin by Western aircraft. The airlift continued into the spring of 1949. On April the 16th and 17th, 1,398 flights landed nearly 13,000 tons of supplies in just 24 hours. By the 9th of May 1949, nearly a year later, the Soviets gave in and eventually lifted the blockade. Stalin had failed to starve the Allies out of Berlin, and the airlift had worked. Amazingly, there was no Allied casualties, military or civilian. West Berlin had survived, and Stalin's attempt to win a propaganda victory over Britain, France, and the USA had actually backfired. The West had responded in a peaceful way to what now looked like an unwise and aggressive act by Stalin. Okay, so that's just an image to show you what it looked like, some of the dropping off of these packages. So what actually happened after the airlift then, or what were the consequences? So the crisis had three major effects. One is that it confirmed the divisions of Germany and Berlin. Two is that it greatly increased East-West rivalry. And three, it led to the creation of something called NATO. Okay, so let's look at each of these in a bit more detail. So after the blockade, it was clear that the division of Germany would continue. The Western Allies quickly moved to create a separate West Germany, and this involved Britain, France, and the USA merging. Became known as the Federal Republic of Germany, or the FRG. It had a new capital called Bonn, and this new country was much bigger than East Germany. On the 14th of August 1949, Germans in the new country were allowed to elect their own parliament, called the Bundestag. And on the 15th of September 1949, the first democratically elected Chancellor of the Federal Republic, Konrad Adenauer, took office. So Stalin responded by creating something called the DDR, or the German Democratic Republic, in October 1949. Only the communist bloc countries recognised it as a nation, and the Federal Republic refused to recognise that Germany had been split into two until the 1970s. For the next 40 years, people would talk about West Germany and East Germany, but for most of the time, each German regarded their own state as the real one, the only real one. So Stalin's threat to Berlin and the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia, which happened in the same year, persuaded the Western powers that they needed a formal military alliance to protect themselves from the Soviet Union. They also wanted to send Stalin a message about their determination to stand firm against communism. So in April 1949, the USA, Britain, France, and 9 other Western countries joined together in something known as NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The members of NATO agreed that if any member was attacked, all members of NATO would come to its assistance. The British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, had played a major part in bringing about this alliance, and he made a speech in the British Parliament in which he said that European countries would welcome American involvement and called on other Western European countries to reach out to the USA. Okay, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snore History Hub.